Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, Shadow of the Erdtree's release, piling on top of the base game itself, caused a lot of interesting situations to pop up, let's say, including the return of old bugs long purged from the base game weapons that were actually returning with the new ones. Things like offhand weapons being able to have buffs applied to them that they really shouldn't, but this was snuffed out pretty quickly, and a lot of the more majorly broken things were fixed in the first couple of patches for the DLC. That said, there are still a lot of just unintended interactions or things that should be happening that maybe are not, and so today we're just going to talk about 10 of the biggest sort of contenders for this, for the most part focusing on things that could be way stronger than they currently are if they worked properly, and better and actually usable if, you know, their bugs were fixed, but with the last couple of entries swinging the sort of opposite direction, as there are a couple of things that are bugged in their favor. Starting off then, let's talk about the Furious Blade of Ansbach incantation. This is a really cool new incantation that you don't get until the very end of the DLC, and it is a multi-hit Blood Flame application, and if you know how Blood Flame works, that means that it should be incredibly strong, not to mention that it is a charged incantation as well, which means that it's even more buffable. The issue with it, then, it doesn't apply Blood Flame. I know, it's crazy, it's literally in the description of it, but it just literally doesn't work. It will not apply bleed to enemies no matter how many times you use it. It does some good damage, which is fine, but imagine if it did that damage while also basically getting a bleed proc every time you cast it, because it hits frequently enough with Blood Flame that it should essentially just do that, and so for now, this incantation is just sort of unusable and very sad as a result, but it is one to absolutely keep your eye on the moment that they fix this. Second up then, we have the Divine Bird Feathers incantation, for a somewhat similar reason. In theory, this incantation is awesome. It's a continuous storm of divine feathers fired out like a Gatling gun for as long as your FP and stamina allow, but the truth is, it's just not working properly. Each individual feather has relatively low damage, sure, and the range is relatively short, but neither of those are necessarily bugs. The bug here is that every individual feather won't count as hitting a target even if they do visually connect with the hitbox. Like another entry later on the list, the game seems to have a sort of hidden internal cooldown on how frequently an enemy can take damage from this spell, and that means even if you see yourself connect with your own eyes with like 20 feathers hitting an enemy, realistically only 5 to 10 of those will actually connect and result in damage numbers popping on your screen, and it just sort of turns what could have been a very cool but niche incantation with things that buff it specially, including a helmet, into just being, you know, not particularly usable to begin with. Then we have just a purely disappointing incantation, which is Rain of Fire. This creates a long, looming, well, exactly what it says on the tin, a Rain of Fire, with the idea being it sort of locks off an area and makes enemies take a bunch of damage if they choose to stand in it anyways. And if you remember the enemy that actually drops this, it is quite effective when used against the player. The problem, of course, is that it does absolutely incredible damage. Incredibly low damage, that is, I should say, as it hits for barely anything at all, to the point that it basically has to be a bug, considering how boostable this spell is in theory, being a Messmer Flame incantation so you can wear his helmet, and the Fire Knight armor uses Seal, and the other two Messmer Flame incantations that are buffable in all the same ways are honestly strong as all hell when you build them properly. Fire Serpent and Messmer's Orb, those are, but for whatever reason, Rain of Fire does just absolutely no meaningful damage when you use it in the same type of setup, which sort of just completely negates the entire point of this spell existing. The idea being that you create a circle that is dangerous for enemies to stand in, but it does just such piddly little hits of damage that bosses don't even feel it, so it's not even really worth casting against them, and against players it doesn't have the intended zoning type of effect because it hits for so little damage that people can just ignore it, walk through it, and hit you anyways. That said, if this was fixed to do actual damage, considering how boostable it is and the way the spell is supposed to work, it could well be quite strong. But right now, it just isn't. Past that, fourth up is actually a Wondrous Flask upgrade tier, the Viridian Hidden tier. This is supposed to be the stamina-based equivalent of the cerulean version of this, giving you infinite stamina for 15 seconds after you drink your flask with this tier inside of it, which is a really interesting concept, except that in 90% of situations, 15 seconds as a timer just is not enough for it to be worth it, with stamina specifically. And the main thing that I would argue that 15 seconds would actually work really well for is guarding and guard poking with shields or with thrusting weapons attached to them too, but for whatever reason, while this tier removes the stamina consumption of literally every other thing in the game that I tested it with, it just literally doesn't work with the stamina cost of blocking, which you still lose stamina from, even with this active, which just completely removes what could easily have been the best use of this tier for its current duration. Aggressively, fully guard poking for the first 15 seconds of a tough fight. I mean, imagine doing Radon phase 1, then drinking this right at the start of phase 2, blocking the Light of Miquella incantation, and then just laying into him for 15 seconds, straight from full safety in one of the most dangerous phases of the most dangerous fight in the game, which would be just incredibly useful. And currently though, it just doesn't interact with guarding at all, which is just such a big disappointment that I hope is fixed sooner rather than later. Fifth today is quite simply a really weird lack of interaction with the Light of Miquella incantation. This incredibly long to cast spell that does just really sort of zoop off a whole area and make it unpassable while it lasts, with a giant pop of damage followed by a rain of extra lights later on. And the thing is, it actually does do a fairly large amount of damage in a pretty large area. The bug with this then, though, is that it just does not count as a Miquella incantation. Yeah, you heard that right. The Light of Miquella, literally has his name in it, does not count as a Miquella incantation. So it isn't boosted by the dryleaf seal, it isn't boosted by the circlet of light helmet from Miquella. Yes, the damage does go up very slightly when you have the helmet on, but that's because the helmet gives you +1 faith, not because the bonus is working, because it should be raising it by 10%. It also doesn't count as a Golden Order incantation either, it's not boosted by the Golden Order boosters. So then what actually is this spell? Surely based on what it is, there is no way to argue that it isn't either a Miquella incantation or a Golden Order spell, so it basically has to be one of those two, and the one that it should be is pretty obvious given the literal name, but it just isn't, so hopefully that does get fixed sooner rather than later. Sixth up then, we have a sort of minimal one but an interesting one to note, which is the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword. This is one of the legendary weapons in the expansion, extremely cool in a bunch of different ways, but this has a very odd bug where not only are the actual usage requirements different between PC and console versions of the game, with it even actually requiring int to use on console, but so is the scaling of the weapon, with it scaling better with arcane on console and better with strength on PC. This isn't totally game flipping by any means, it doesn't ruin the weapon, but it is a very weird inconsistency between these two different versions of the game that undeniably is a bug. It's just a question of which version is actually the bugged version and which one is intended. Then next up we have Yori's Staff Spear, and this is sort of the turning point of where we go from bugs that make things weaker to bugs that make things stronger, simply because this one is sort of in the middle, being hit by what are presumably two separate bugs on either side of this problem. The bug that would make it stronger if fixed is similar to the Divine Bird Feathers incantation from earlier. When you use this weapon skill, it fires out a continuous barrage of golden arcs, a whole load of them, but for whatever reason, even if visually the hitbox of each arc connects with an enemy, they will only take damage from about a quarter or 1/5 of the ones that actually fire out, with the result being it just hits for way lower damage than it theoretically should because of this, and it makes an incredibly cool and unique weapon generally quite bad in actual practice. But then there is the second part of this, the flip side to it, which means that it would be unbelievably broken if every arc counted as hitting, because the weapon itself has innate bleed buildup as a status, and for whatever reason the arcs fired from this weapon skill apply the bleed buildup from range on every hit. So because this hits much less than it should, this is just sort of a neat niche interaction, but if they fix the hit rate without removing the bleed interaction, this thing would become an absolute stick of death that everyone was terrified of.
Wanna buy some death sticks?
Eighth up then is Ansbach's Bow, to bring it back to Ansbach, and this one is pretty simple in how it is broken. The weapon skill fires out a fan of arrows using 8 arrows per cast, and usually you would assume that this means that you want to use it at close range, but for whatever reason, there's actually currently a bug with this that makes it so if even one of the 8 arrows hits an enemy, it will count as all 8 hitting. This means that it will apply the full damage, and more importantly, it applies the full status buildup, allowing for incredibly quick access to something like sleep at long range, with minimal need to even aim it due to the spread of the shots. Ninth today is the Bonnie Butchering Knife, and this weapon is sort of just fine. It is the DLC unique version of the base game Butchering Knife, giving a small amount of health on every hit, but more importantly, the unique skill increases your damage while active and gives you a doubling to the health on hit, an extra 1% health regen when you hit an enemy. The bug with this one then is actually pretty easy to visualize, but sort of weird to explain before you see it in action. Specifically, when the skill is inactive, when you don't have it on, it is still actually stacking up a hidden number. When you hit an enemy, you heal for 1% maximum health, that's the passive of the weapon, but then also 1% maximum health will be added to this hidden counter. When you activate the skill, you are instantly healed for whatever that hidden number was built up to. So let's say that you hit enemies 50 times before activating the skill, then upon activation, you will be instantly healed for 50% of your maximum health, which is definitely not the intended function of the skill by any means, but it is a neat little thing that you can use while it's around. Then finally we have something that has grown pretty infamous over the last few weeks, the Greatsword of Damnation, the boss weapon from Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and this one is relatively simple as well, and if you've done pretty much any PvP, you probably already know about it, but the skill on this weapon is quite unique in that it counts as a pin attack, grabbing an enemy and rendering them helpless if you actually hit it properly on a humanoid foe, but if you miss the grab, it still has a follow-up attack that you can use that fires thorns up from the ground, which is actually quite useful. because it stops people from punishing a missed pin. Normally this would just be a really solid PvP weapon because of that function in itself, but currently the hitbox on it is busted as hell. It is literally broken. Literally the pin will grab people who are multiple feet away from the animation. It will occasionally grab people who are mid-roll. It is just pinning things it has absolutely no business grabbing, and pretty much everyone agrees that this has to be a bug because there's no way that a pin should ever be able to work like this. There's just no other way to explain it. Most of the time when a bug is positively affecting a weapon though and making it stronger than it would be without it, I am less inclined to say it should be fixed, but this one is an exception because it pretty much only works against players, and it simply creates an unfair environment in all player combat situations where the weapon exists. That just about does it for today then everyone. Just a collection of weapons and items and spells that for whatever reason are pretty undeniably just not working as intended, broken in the most literal of ways, and of course what is wrong with them too. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and of course feel free to leave your own thoughts on all these down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.